coming to you live, but not really. It is all pump and no circumstance with Ryder Richards on LetUsThinkAboutIt.com, the amateur hour you should never tune into.
Welcome back. This is Ryder Richards with Let Us Think About It. Last episode, Step 48, we covered the lure of optimization and, of course, habit formation. But, of course, also, given the way that our podcast goes, towards the end, we sort of settled on this notion that it might not be as much of a lure as some sort of drive for survival. In a very work-obsessed culture that's, of course, increasingly precarious, unequal, and leaving people behind. So the lure is there, sure, because who doesn't want to be amazing? But one of the compelling reasons that the lure for productivity is so strong is that we might actually feel like the forest is burning down behind us. And of course, you damn well better be in good shape so you can outrun everybody else and then jump like a hero onto the helicopter as it flies away from the wreckage of our society. Yeah, that's kind of dark. Anyway, this time we're going to get a little more practical with this New York Times bestseller, Atomic Habits by James Clear. And seriously, I'm going to really try not to do my typical thing, which is jumping off in philosophical or social pontifications. We're just going to give you an episode loaded with best practices and advice. And then the next episode, I'm actually going to bring in a whole bunch of pitfalls about optimization, productivity, and habit fixation. And I'm going to compare all that by relating it to things like superheroes and cartoons and, of course, whatever else I can think of. So yeah, stay prepared for that. But for right now, get ready for about 20 minutes of life-changing productivity hacks so you can hack your way into being a whole human. Part 1. The Aggregation of Marginal Gains. Habits are really about identity change. Behavior change is simply the means to get there, the feedback loop. So the number one highest recommended book for bros like me at the end of the year, it was on like everyone's top 10 list or whatever, was James Clear's Atomic Habits. So, of course, I was hesitant because I like to think that I'm, just a little beyond mainstream advice. But I'm not, because I listened to it and it was honestly really good. And of course, James Clear's story is also sort of a testament to these atomic habits. So what are atomic habits? Well, yeah, these are the smallest possible habits, tiny little things that you can begin doing quite easily, and before you know it, you will have grown and changed as a person. Now, it isn't always the big things that change us most of the time. It might actually just be the accumulation over time of a lot of small things. So, for instance, the British cycling team wasn't doing so well. And then they decided to bring in this new coach, Dave Brailsford. And the funny thing is, these cyclists have already dedicated their life to cycling, so they've got to be pretty good, right? But at the elite level, really, what's the difference between good and great? Well, it's probably only a few percentage points or maybe seconds. So this new coach, knowing this, I guess he decided to implement very small incremental changes. Things that were really like trying out different tires or different rims and, even considering the weather and trying out things like different massage lotions. Just to increase recovery time. I don't even know how you test for that, right? But these were implemented, and these small daily changes actually became habits that started changing the people themselves. All of a sudden, they're more concerned with better sleep, better diet, and they have a heightened awareness of small, nuanced issues. So maybe they didn't see immediate results from this, but within a couple of years they did, because these gains start to accumulate over time. Now, this is known as the aggregation of marginal gains. And the idea here is if you only get 1% better every day in a specific task that you're really dedicated to, well, by the end of the year, you're going to be 37% better. That sounds great, right? Of course, we might want more, but the idea is that then you have to multiply this across 2 to 3 to 5 to 7 years, however long it's going to take, right? And by that point, if this is possible to maintain, you're going to be phenomenal at whatever this is. As Clear says, small habits don't add up, they compound. And sure enough, Dave Brailsford and the British cycling team. As of 2018, they were winning 5 of the last 6 Tour de France events with 3 different riders. They were capturing dozens of gold medals and setting many Olympic and world records in the process. So obviously, their system works. But of course, now for the letdown. The optimization apparently continued outside of the parameters into these kind of legal gray zones, right? These quasi-legal spaces. And now everything is quasi-Lance Armstrong in cycling again, right? And this is something we need to look at. If your behaviors are about your identity, well, then what does this story tell us about how carefully we need to choose our goals?
Part 2, Slow Burn.
So it's not about getting what you want. The power of habits is actually to change who you are or who you want to become. It's not just a little thing about what you want as a goal. This is a fundamental point because you're going to have to really want to change, and it will take daily habits performed over years for it to actually happen. So currently, you are facing challenges, life challenges, things you encounter every day. And Clear says that your habits are actually just the automated solutions that solve the problems your brain faces regularly. Of course, however, the good news is these small behavior changes that we can do, these habits over time, end up producing results. So Clear's analogy for this is the ice cube. Of all things, right? So if the ice cube, if you have one and it's sitting in a room and it's a cold room, it's at 23 degrees, and you heat up that room by 1 degree, well, what happens to that ice cube? Nothing happens, right? It just sits there. So this is kind of like me being on a diet for one day and being like, nothing happened, right? But if we could heat this room up, let's say we do it in 1 degree increments for 8 or 9 more times, and you might want to think about that as 8 or 9 more years. Well, what happens when we magically hit 32 degrees? Well, the ice begins to melt. So the lesson that Clear and several other authors I've read articulate is that it takes somewhere between 5 to 8 years to become an overnight success. And during this time, pretty much no one around you is going to see much of a difference. But then suddenly, bam, there's going to be a state change. So you hear things all the time like, slow and steady wins the race. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Be the turtle, not the hare. Be the hedgehog, not the fox, right? And we hear this repeatedly, these little aphorisms, parables, wise sayings. But of course, it's really hard to stick to anything. It's really hard to maintain these habits, these behaviors. And part of that's because we're impatient, right? But this might also be because of another concept that we aren't aware of that James Clear brings up. And this is the plateau of latent potential and the valley of disappointment. I have to say them like that because, of course, they sound like bad fantasy fiction titles. Of course, what happens to us mostly is that we end up plateau while we're expecting these steady upward linear gains. So what's happening? I'm putting in the work and nothing's changing, right? So what might be happening is that we are actually getting 1% better every day, but we expect the outcomes on this chart to keep pointing upwards. And Clear says that what really happens is it's more kind of like a dip before we rise exponentially. So for a long time, we might sort of be in this valley of disappointment, this valley of despair, the gorge of despair, the crevasse of despondency, whatever you want to call it, right? And this is basically me giving up on a diet early or not pursuing a dream anymore because I am busily, impatiently measuring my results and the results aren't adding up. Clear says, you do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems. So yeah, having big goals, well, that's normal. Everyone has a dream. But having a big dream, having big passion, that alone will not get us there. It's really the daily systems, the annual systems, the kind of things that we put in place that are going to get us there. But to do this, we also must be very aware. Clear says, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. So, yeah, I know. You thought you were going to get away with a podcast that wasn't about, existentialism. It was just only full of life hacks, right? But, of course, this is all big picture existential at some point because we need to be directing where we go. So do you remember this kind of story? I think I've talked about it before. It's this idea of the elephant and the rider, where the rider is sitting on top of the elephant and they think they're in control, but the unconscious is the elephant, right? And that's our unconscious. And if it decides to walk left, well, we're sitting on top as the ego and we pretend that we are in control. And we say things like, yes, I wanted to go that direction anyway. Go ahead, elephant, right? But the thing is, to not be driven by the invisible forces of the unconscious, the elephant, we must actually become deeply aware. and we must work on how we can align the elephant, our unconscious, with our goals, rather than kind of continuing to use this silly post hoc rationalization when our unconscious just keeps running us into low-hanging tree limbs and we're forced to act like we're in control and say things like, oh no, I just love being beaten with tree limbs. It's fantastic, really. It's great for the back. So the insight here is that we felicitously think that our habits help us achieve a goal. But really, our habits are behaviors, and those actions, those behaviors, that's what determines your identity. Because at the end of the day, you are what you do. As Clear says, your identity feeds your habits, and your habits feed your identity. And this forms a constant feedback loop. So, this whole thing, this is not about just collecting hacks. And Clear says the goal here is, of course, not to fill your life with hacks. It is actually to focus on the big goals and learn to embody your values and identity with the big wins. Now, to do this, you must spend some time figuring out where the heck you're going, right? Before you start optimizing your path. Now, first things first, right? If your priorities, let's say that they're a car and you're about to drive off of a cliff, well, you don't need to be worrying about the gas mileage you're getting, right? You need to actually be turning the wheel to turn the car. So, if we want to pause for just a second and think about this, I think Clear is giving us a whole bunch of great information here, and I would hesitantly say that most of us simply move forward on a type of unexamined momentum. But maybe we have a goal, like, for instance, I would like to write a book, and I have written a series of essays. I think they're pretty good, but I'm biased. But that's all kind of what led to this podcast, because a marketing person told me that to build my audience for the book, I needed to start blogging or podcasting. So here I am, but somewhere along the way, I keep doing things that a podcaster would do, not what an author would do. As I'm going along, do I need to turn the wheel? Because we're not just picking up the habits of somebody like an author, like a Hemingway, who writes every day starting at 5 a.m. for 3 hours, no matter how hungover he is, right? Because interestingly enough, if you take on this habit of writing 3 hours a day, your identity will change. You will become a writer, but hopefully you won't pick up the drinking habit as well. And of course, the idea that your habits actually change who you are. You really are changing your identity by changing your behavior. So that's where I also want to caution us. Be cautious, don't go into this all willy-nilly. And one way I've been kind of trying to think about this is your goals can be out in front of you and those can pull you forward. But what you need to also have going on is habits that are behind you that are pushing you. And you don't necessarily just want to copycat people and just take cold showers because rich people do it. That's silly, right? But there might actually be something to it, such as the dedication to get into a cold shower forms a kind of mental resiliency. So sometimes these exterior behaviors, perhaps you're merely performing them at first, they can actually manifest a change for your interior motivations as well. Part 3. Habit Stack. So if you're ever worried, you might have just an instant of downtime, or maybe you're going to forget to be grateful or forget to be productive for 3 whole minutes. Well, if we got something for you, it's called habit stacking. So remember, Clear says that our habits are just the automated solutions that solve the problems your brain faces regularly. Now, we can hack our environmental awareness to actually stack or link things together, and this can kind of make a mutually reinforcing chain of behaviors or habits. Clear talks about this habit stack in terms of habits and what creates them, right? So for a habit, we have something like a cue, and that cue triggers a craving, which prompts a response, and then we get a reward. An example of this might be something as simple as I feel an itch, I want to scratch the itch, I scratch it, and my reward is relief. So cue, craving, response, reward. And this is a cycle that just keeps going. But the cue can actually be developed, right? We can kind of hack it according to things like time or location or even by a preceding event. So you can trigger cues to link or stack habits together. And this can potentially drive out old bad habits and replace them with potentially good habits. So an easy one that Clear brings up is something like, I might close my laptop and every time I do, I would do something physical like 10 push-ups or stretch for 5 minutes. This is just a little prompt to get you to do something physical after doing something non-physical to sort of help your body out here. But as well, when we start talking about cues and habit formation, there's a lot of science that is brought up by James Clear and guys like George Ainsley and Andrew Huberman. And they all can kind of talk about motivation, willpower, and dopamine, right? Dopamine being this motivation chemical that is released around habits and cues, and how over time there is a kind of a pleasure pain balance that shifts. And this is related to addiction, where you're no longer deriving pleasure from a habit that was once pleasurable. But you're still driven to do it anyway. You're motivated to do it. And this can actually hurt yourself and those around you. But of course, that's all kind of dark stuff. And we can get into that another day. But for now, we're going to get back into habit stacking. But I just wanted you to be aware that there are actually chemical dependencies in your body that can create these habits. So, a mental habit stack. Let's look at this kind of more complicated advanced version. Tom Bilyeu from Impact Theory. He says that after meditating, you have just reduced a lot of the cognitive stress and the sort of jumpy anxiety of your brain. That's a technical term. But during this kind of super open and calm state, anything you do afterwards should be a little more focused and your brain should be more receptive. So for instance, you might want to stack something like meditation and journaling future goals together, right? Or maybe you should meditate and then read, allowing your mind to absorb the content without the typical daily cognitive anxiety. As well, this can work with physical habit stacks or performance habit stacks, right? So when you do something like workout for 30 to 40 minutes, a really intense workout, where your body becomes super absorptive of protein or pretty much anything else you put into it for about 20 minutes post-workout. So this is a peak window that you should really take advantage of for gains and, of course, to decrease soreness and inflammation and whatnot. Now, this knowledge, knowing when you can maximize your efforts with just a little bit of a stack, can actually allow things in your life to interlock and to really make sense so you can maximize stuff. Now, the knowledge helps, but equally, we need to be somehow prepping ourselves for this success. So at night, right, maybe you need to cue yourself in the evening to prepare your protein for your workout the next day. And maybe that takes the shape of you physically stacking your toothpaste on top of your protein tub so that you remember it, right? I don't know exactly what that looks like, but there might also be things like you make your protein shake and then you put it in the fridge. Well, you don't want to drive off and leave it, so how are you going to remind yourself to get it in the morning? Maybe you put your car keys in the fridge, right? But then again, if this is late at night and you have some sort of other habit stack that's like, I have to do 10 burpees every time I open the fridge door, well, then you're going to be all pumped up and anxious before you have to fall asleep. So anyway, just be cautious about these habit stacks, experiment with them a little bit and see what works best for you.
Just the tips. Tip 1.
Apparently, drinking a full glass of water before going to sleep and after waking is a great practice. After you wake up, you tend to have exhaled a couple of pounds of water, which of course you need to replenish. Now, another tip, add some pink Himalayan salt and lime juice to your morning water. This is kind of like a poor man's diet Gatorade with electrolytes, and this really helps refresh all the minerals you lost overnight.
Tip 2.
Stack that one with this one, and this one is gleaned from Dr. Andrew Huberman. Taking omega-3 fatty acids and creatine seems to help good mental health and push back against depression, so why not do it? So just lay out your vitamins in the morning and include omega-3s and creatine in the mix.
Tip 3.
While you're gulping down vitamins with your poor man's Gatorade, get some sunlight into your eyeballs. This is also from Dr. Andrew Huberman. So basically, your body is a clock. Your circadian rhythms should be set by gathering at least 10 to 15 minutes of low-level sunlight. So this basically means morning and evening light. Interestingly, from 10 to 4 p.m., direct sunlight actually decreases dopamine production. That's right, it makes you sad. So low-level light is good, high noon, bad. And you just need to ask a cowboy. I mean, of course, they always ride off in the sunset, spurs a-jangling and waving adios. But at high noon, yeah, they shoot at each other. This is crazy.
Part 4. Environment.
Sometimes success is less about making good habits easy and more about making bad habits hard. So, to improve, we can try things like drugs, herbs, supplements, vitamins, lotions, or maybe just snort crushed dreams. I don't know. We might get some gains out of just about anything, and we can make those into good habits. But what about bad habits? What about temptation? What about willpower? Well, we as a species mostly suck at willpower. We're really good with temptation though, right? But the latest science on willpower shows that willpower is kind of like a battery charge. And you have a certain amount of it every day, and if you use it all up, you basically have to go to sleep to recharge and get more of it. So I did an episode, Step 19, on Breakdown of Will. This is a book by George Ainsley, where he kind of goes through understanding temptation and addiction and cues and all that kind of stuff to lead us to understanding how willpower functions. And we really need to change our thinking as a society. We need to consider willpower and discipline as a limited resource, not as a character trait. And then we can actually begin to set up our lives to not only avoid temptation, like things like food and procrastination, but we can also make our environment serve us by limiting bad distractions and planting good ones. So here's a small behavior hack. If you don't drink enough water, simply put bottles or glasses of water around you when you start your day, so you no longer need the willpower to walk all the way to the fridge to get water every so often. Now, this is just slightly modifying your environment, but of course, we might also want to form a habit stack to help us, some sort of cue, right? So when you enter your office, you gather up all the empty water bottles from yesterday and fill them all up again and redisperse them before you let yourself get a cup of coffee. Well, you could also form a reward habit stack where you flip that. And every time you drink a cup of water, you get to reward yourself with a cup of coffee. Or maybe you get to check Instagram for 5 minutes. I don't know, whatever your drug is. But of course, be careful of these reward stacks. We have just talked about dopamine and the pleasure-pain balance earlier and how it can lead to addiction and other kind of negative side effects. And at the end of the day, we don't want to train ourselves to be entitled to a reward for doing something so mundane as just drinking a cup of water. So Clear brings up that your environment is an invisible hand that guides your behavior. What often looks like a lack of willpower is actually the result of a poor environment. So, as an example, when we're in nature, we actually adapt to our surroundings to make our lives easier. So we would go to the other side of the hill so the wind doesn't buffet you. We'd get under a tree so the sun doesn't buffet you. We turn off the soft rock station so Jimmy doesn't buffet you. Right? We can basically make our life easier through our environment. And we can get rid of all these small annoyances that are going to sap our strength and, make us think about margaritas. Okay, yeah. But anyway, how do you do this? If you know you have limited willpower, well, early in the day, while you're still fresh and full of all this discipline vigor, what you can do is set up your environment to aid that sort of weak-willed ninny that you're going to become in the afternoons. Now, if you suffer from things like checking social media, then early in the day, set a software to block it until after work. If you eat too much lunch, pre-pack your lunch into a smaller Tupperware container. And of course, you need to do this while you're strong-willed in the morning and take that decision away from the future weak-willed you. Now, if you tend to do things like skip the gym in the afternoon, well, how can you figure a way to make that part of your daily schedule? Because is that gym on the way home from work? Well, if it is, it's probably also on the way to work as well. And yes, I know, waking up early in the morning, you probably are going to hate having to shower in the morning at the gym with all those old men because they're just way too immodest, right? Or perhaps our morning beauty ritual, our ablutions, are somehow more important than our physical exercise. And when we get into these kind of things, we really start needing to look at our priorities. Would waking up another hour earlier allow you to do everything you want to do? Well, probably not, right? How about 3? Is that too big of an ask? Because honestly, maybe it is, but maybe you could work up to it. So the real question here is, what do you really want? Clear says, winners often win because their environment makes winning easier. I really like that quote in a lot of ways because it reminds me of this little cartoon I once saw whenever I was having a tough time at a job. And it was saying that it's hard to heal yourself when you're stuck in a toxic environment. And sometimes the hardest thing is making the change that can let you thrive, and not just thrive today or tomorrow, because of course we're like that ice cube, right? And it might take us 2 to 5 to 8 years to become that overnight success we know we can be. But it's never going to happen if we don't start with the tiny things first. All right, many thanks for listening, and of course, I want you, dear listener, to make Let Us Think About It a habit as well. Why not? I have the chance, I might as well plug my own show. So yeah, subscribe, like, tweet, and of course, share this episode with a friend. Because this is one thing that we really didn't get into, is that to truly stick with things, to create lasting habits, you need an accountability buddy. You can call that an accountability buddy, just to make it more fun to say. This is a relationship where you check in with each other, you get feedback, and you can talk about your hardships. Of course, after you do that, we have to get back up on that habit horse and ride on down the trail. And as you may know, I have also started a blog. This is one of my daily habits, offering daily wads of wisdom gleaned from navel gazing. So you can find this by going to bellybuttonlint.blog and joining the mailing list. And if you do that, you're going to receive a daily meditation, notion, or just whatever the heck it is that gets scraped out from between my ears. Now, once again, that's bellybuttonlint.blog. So next week, we're going to be covering some of the science of optimization, but also the story of science as a tool to become super productive to turn us into superheroes. But we're also going to talk about the hidden costs. Until then, stay safe and think some silly thoughts.